Please be seated. Brother Payne, just before the lunch break, I was asking you about the structure for the governance of schools. Can I ask you, please, to tell us to what extent are the De La Salle brothers themselves involved in the governance of schools?
Now, they are involved, first of all, as the members of each of the incorporated companies, so that the membership of those companies is restricted to the Provincial Council, with the exception of the Mission Council, where the brother visitor is the sole member. From the point of view of the boards, there are now only 3 brothers, I believe, active members of school boards. The rest are persons from the laity who have volunteered in general terms their services to act as board members following invitations to express an interest. They are in the majority male, though there's a small number of female members also. The company which conducts now Your Town, which is the survivor or the successor of Boys Town, but the company there is made up of one only brother, a lay chairman, and the members of that board have actually responded to advertisements carried out through the Association of Company Directors and have expressed interest and have been appointed following that. The overwhelming majority there are not Catholic, and they include three women who have been on the boards for Boys Town for probably 5 or 6 years. The Chief Executive Officer of the Your Town board is Tracy Adams, is obviously female, and the chairman of the board in South Australia is Murray Dorrington.
Thank you, brother. Now, I want to ask you some questions about your response to the data which has emerged in relation to the De La Salle brothers, taking into account duration of ministry. That the data report concludes that 13.8% of De La Salle brothers who ministered between 1950 and 2010 were the subject of a claim of child sexual abuse. You've heard what Brother Clinch and Brother Carroll said about their own reflections in their particular orders about what might have contributed to the levels of incidents of abuse giving rise to claims. Can I ask you, do you agree with the factors that they have identified as also being relevant to an understanding of the De La Salle's historical position?
Certainly. I think there are some other factors which apply particularly to the majority of abuse cases which have been recorded, which show a preponderance associated with Boys Town Badessa.
Sorry, can you just explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think if the statistics show that something like over 150 of those complaints have arisen out of boys from Boys Town Badessa.
Right.
And when the list of institutions with the highest number of complaints has been recorded, it's Boys Town Badessa.
And are there features of the way Boys Town operated or the way that De La Salle brothers at that institution operated that you think explain the preponderance of abuse?
Yes, I think there are issues which are both cultural and structural. I think in terms of cultural issues, I accept and support the explanations that have been put forward by other people. I wish to assure the Commission that if I'm offering some observations, they're not meant in any way to be excuses. there's nothing that can excuse the preponderance of allegations that have been made at Boys Town, and it's something that has shocked people that have supported Boys Town over many years. It's also been a question of a great deal of a loss of confidence on the part of brothers who thought that Boys Town was in fact one of the jewels in the crown. And from the point of view of the a growing awareness of the impact on people's lives, I believe that my experience in the settlement of claims that have been made out of Boys Town has brought about a similar awareness of the damages that I'm sure the members of the Commission have arrived at following private sessions with these people. So that in that sense, if I put anything forward, it's meant to be descriptive rather than a question of trying to excuse.
Yes.
In terms of the culture, I think there are some particular aspects of the culture of the De La Salle brothers that are perhaps just slightly in addition to the matters that have been given to the Commission. I believe that the first instance about the question of child abuse is that it is almost certainly associated with a sense of secrecy. It is an offence that occurs in secret. And in terms of the culture of the De La Salle brothers, over the progress through the 20th century, I believe that that sense of secrecy was part and parcel of the culture. I believe that it was demonstrated in such advice as was given to me as a young brother. Never ask a brother where he's going, where he's been, or where did he get that from. I think also from the point of view of the question of the sense of privacy, misplaced, but there's a sense of don't ask and don't tell. And I think from the point of view of the responsibility of the brothers who were in terms of their exercise of leadership, there was an overvaluation of the importance of confidentiality. Those aspects, in my view, help to explain the unexplainable or the indefensible, but at least I believe they were particularly characteristic of the situation of Boys Town from when it operated from about 1962 until 2002. The structural kinds of things, you'll have noticed in my CV that I did a study of Boys Town in the late 60s. The conclusion of that study was that there was no theoretical underpinning for whatever was happening there. And in the first instance, that structural absence or that structural deficit in terms of having no clear indication of the rationale, the outcomes, and certainly not in any sense milestones or any of the things we take for granted these days, I believe that was a fundamental kind of flaw from the beginning. It took two administrations at Boys Town to regularise the whole question of schooling, and that was just for me an indication of the question of the ship not necessarily being rudderless, but certainly lacking in the kind of directional reference points that you would normally expect. I believe the second structural aspect was the question of the challenge that the clientele at Boys Town offered to the brothers who were there. It was a challenge basically coming from young men who had in many cases, a record of placement in a whole series of correctional or foster homes. I believe that the priority that was taken to be the first necessity in such a situation with these young men was the exercise of control. On that basis, I believe the selection of personnel to staff Boys Town was effectively the selection of people who had proven themselves in school situations that they were able to control young men. The question of whether that control was exercised through excessive corporal punishment was one of the conclusions of the Ford Commission's inquiry into Boys Town. And I believe that when you look at the statistics that are included in the extended statement, you'll notice that there are something like 242 allegations of physical abuse as part of the picture. There's a good deal of evidence that suggests that physical abuse is associated with sexual abuse, and I believe that's another structural aspect of it. The elements that both Brother Peter Carroll and Brother Peter Clinch have indicated about the question of supervision, we had a strong tradition in the district that when a man was put in charge of a particular area, it was up to him to make the most of it, and that became a solitary kind of exercise. It has all the shortcomings of any assumptions that are made that people can do things without supervision, and from that point of view I believe that that was another major structural issue that helps account for the statistics as they result.
Can I just ask about a couple of aspects of what you've said there? Are you drawing a connection, when you talk about the lack of a theoretical underpinning for what was happening at Boys Town, and I think in context you were drawing a connection between that and the incidents of abuse. What's the link that you see?
I believe that there's possibly a link from the point of view that if people do not have a clear statement of intention, responsibility, rules of engagement, if you will, then left to their own in circumstances in which a whole series of other, what I believe to be cultural issues at that time of the century, then the likelihood is that there's a less effective method of establishing some kind of break or some kind of discouragement of behaviour that could not be justified under any circumstances.
And is it for the same reason that you've talked about it taking too long to introduce proper administrative structures in schools?
Yes.
Thank you.
Are you, excuse me, Mr. Free, are you suggesting as a framework, a form of code of conduct, which is, of course, won't work unless it's effectively enforced, will it?
My first point was, I suppose, there was no code of conduct. And I agree that the whole purpose of codes of conduct or statements of intent or roadmaps for a particular institution provide the basis for demands that can be appropriately made. If those previous statements aren't in position, then it becomes a question of chance, really, as to what happens.
In governance, just speaking generally, rules, which is a word you used, are commonly exhibited through codes of conduct to which people sign and commit themselves.
Yeah. I've got no problem with that.
Brother, you've talked about the culture of secrecy historically in the De La Salles as possibly an explanatory factor. Has that changed?
First of all, from the point of view of our reflections over since about the time we closed Boys Town, which was 2002, we closed it in a sense that we could no longer adequately care for those boys that were coming. I believe that that was a turning point in terms of our willingness to at least discuss matters. But still, there is an element of secrecy which is tied up with confidentiality, is the is the encouraging term that's used for it, but there is certainly a question of a deep respect for the fact that not everybody has to know everything.
Are there structures in place now that might mitigate the risk of that continuing secrecy streak?
There are, in the sense that we now have in the first instance, we now have a well-established process of referral of our decisions and of the allegations that might be made to an external consultative committee. The advantage of that is that consultative committee, which consists of the provincial, the deputy provincial, myself, a lawyer and 3 ladies and a public relations person, that consultative committee, right, meets every 6 times a year, and on the basis of that regularly receives reports of the progress of complaints that have been made, the details of those complaints and the proposed action that should be taken.
Is that one of the operational reforms you've described as having occurred since the Royal Commission started?
That's it.
Thank you. And you've also, I think, in that same period, so in the last 3 or 4 years, introduced a full-time professional standards office.
Yes.
You also have, I think, in that same period, introduced an external audit process.
Well, I think my statement says it's in progress. The external audit progress, and obviously Catholic Professional Standards Incorporated, obviously comes in on top of that and would be seen to be perhaps a substitute. The challenge that faces the district is that the question of child protection in 4 different jurisdictions is an extraordinarily complex one. So that from the first establishment of the audit was to say what are the baselines. So we did an extensive study of child protection requirements and regulation in Australia, New Zealand, as they exist in Papua New Guinea and as they exist in Pakistan. You'll understand that in Pakistan, child protection involves making sure that there are great walls of security around schools so that terrorists can't, attack the children. So the levels of child protection and the issues of child protection across those 4 jurisdictions are extraordinarily different. You'll be aware that in New Zealand that the approach to the question of child protection is much more community-based than it is in Australia in terms of the legislature that's in place. So that with those kinds of things, the next thing to do was to establish what we regarded to be other standards that could be tested across the district. And those standards are set out in various policy documents of which the Commission has copies. The audit then has really only taken off in close kinds of detail in Pakistan, where the effort has been to try to explore the processes in our schools there and to say these are what we're looking for and these are the kinds of issues. There are significant issues that are tied up with Christians as a minority in Pakistan, which are different. As far as our Australian schools are concerned, we believe that the standards that we've proposed are gold standard. We also believe that each of those schools has to meet the requirements of the Catholic education authorities within the jurisdictions. And our approach there to the audit is simply to compare and tick off what's been covered and to suggest that if there is something that hasn't been covered, then that might be addressed by the school as an additional extra.
And you anticipate, do you, that the work of the Catholic Professional Standards Body, which has been introduced, might take up that work?
My understanding is that the principal work of that committee in the first instance, or that body in the first instance, will be the establishment of suitable audits.
Thank you, brother. Now, in terms of formation for your order, I understand from your statement that it's something of a trickle for your organisation. New candidates in Australia are fairly rare these days.
The last person to join us in Australia made his final profession last Saturday. He did his training in the United States and is currently teaching in New Zealand.
Thank you. How often do you have someone present for candidacy in Australia?
He was the. We've had 2 or 3 young men express an interest. Their interest has been encouraged in the same way as Brother Peter Carroll described in terms of an aspirancy. Currently, in the community that I'm living in Bankstown, there is one young man there who has just commenced an aspirancy program, but it is not yet a formation program. He has gained a position. He's a trained teacher. He's gained a position in the school that we participate there in Bankstown, and he's operating there.
Thank you. What's the policy of the De La Salle brothers in terms of brothers who have been either criminally convicted or who have been found through other processes to have committed acts of child sexual abuse?
The policy has to be regarded, I think, at 2 levels. There is an awareness of the Pope's declaration on the Feast of the Holy Innocents this year in terms of zero tolerance. Now, the strict interpretation of zero tolerance leaves no option but to say that the person should leave the institute. Whilst the Pope may have said that in terms of the statement of the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the fact is that the canon law, as I think you've probably been reliably informed, does not yet catch up with the pronouncement. So our efforts are therefore to see to what extent we can exercise zero tolerance in our own backyard. And the only efforts that are currently the issues that are open to us are to absolutely prohibit the engagement of a person in such a situation from any ministry. Currently we are in the process of appointing an officer similar to that one described by Brother Peter Carroll in terms of supervision, because our concern is that whilst there's a great deal to be said about the advantage of persons remaining in the institute because they are less danger there than they might be in the general community, the reality of supervising persons who are afflicted in the way these people are is an extraordinarily difficult, practical, managerial operation. And we are not yet satisfied that despite our explorations of things like circles of support and accountability, which we've had a good look at, despite that we're not convinced that we have in fact addressed that issue satisfactorily of supervision. So that's basically where we are on that.
So in practical terms, with a brother in that position, do you ask them to leave the order?
We ask them to leave the order of their own volition. We had a brother in that situation who obtained his dispensation in the last 3 weeks.
Have you had any brothers who've been asked to leave the order and have declined?
Yes.
What do you do in that situation?
We continue to negotiate. In the particular case, we have prepared a brief for our Procurator General. I'm sorry for that, but the Procurator General of the Institute is the man who has the negotiations with the Vatican as his responsibility. We prepared a brief to be addressed to the Congregation for Societies of Apostolic Life, seeking to take advantage of one of the canons which says if all else fails, persons can be dismissed. The interpretation of that, however, has resulted in us receiving an indication back that the same kind of application was made by our own General Council last year, and the Sacred Congregation declined to accept it and pointed to the ordinary provisions of the canons, which set out a whole process which is very difficult to implement after the offence has been committed.
does that then mean you're obliged to continue to treat that brother as a part of the order?
Yes.
What's the nature of the difficulties?
Sorry?
What are the nature of the difficulties that which you expect?
The nature of the difficulty is that the persons that we're speaking about are persons who have in fact either been convicted or have in fact been found by our own internal investigation to be on the balance of probabilities to be guilty of the offence. The canons require you to give a series of formal warnings. It's a bit late for the formal warning.
Brother Payne, the De La Salle brothers have a written policy on the provision of legal assistance in criminal cases.
Yes.
And as I understand it, the effect of that policy is, as with the Christian brothers and the Morris brothers, or perhaps at least the Christian brothers, the De La Salles will assess any request for financial assistance on a case-by-case basis?
We'll assess it up until the committals, and depending upon the outcome of the committal, we will practically guarantee it up until the committal. If there is a committal to trial, then the situation becomes a question of us taking advice from the Defence Counsel and referring it to a brief in Melbourne to get the indication as to what the likely outcome is of the consideration of the evidence. And on that basis, we're in a position to say to a person, and have said to a person, that the issues, on the best advice we can get, is that we would support you from the point of view of making pleas, but we will not support you either for a full trial or alternatively for an appeal.
Thank you, brother. Brother Graham, can I turn to you, please?
Yes.
Can you state your full name?
Timothy John Graham.
Thank you. And you are the Provincial of the St John of God Order?
That's correct.
Now, you've provided a statement to the Royal Commission dated the 17th of October 2016.
Correct.
Are the contents of that statement true and correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Now, can you just describe for us, please, what the current activities of the members of your order in Australia are?
In terms of services, you mean?
Yes, to the extent that they're in active ministry first.
The brothers in Australia consist of 19 men, most of whom are in their 70s and 80s, the majority of whom are living in independent living options in aged care facilities.
Now, I think you've indicated in your statement there's one member of the province who's in active external ministry.
Yes, that's a brother in Melbourne who is involved with the Missionaries of Charity and their soup kitchen in Brunswick.
And then some other brothers are involved in internal ministry.
That would be people like me or the province bursar and other brothers who are responsible for the aged care needs of their fellow brothers, for instance, taking them to the doctors or the chiropractor or whatever. They themselves would probably be in their 70s as well.
And, brother, I take it from your statement that it's been a long time since there were any new candidates.
1998 was the last time we had a candidate.
Right.
We don't actively pursue vocations, and we don't foresee that there will be any vocations into the future.
So St John of God is effectively winding down in Australia?
Effectively. And part of the reason why in 2007 we merged our services in with the Sisters of St John of God Service, PJP, St John of God Australia,
yes,
was because of the diminution and ageing of the brothers. And we were no longer able to provide appropriate governance or management of our services.
Thank you. Now, does that mean that your job essentially involves managing the needs of those?
My main job is to manage the aged care needs of the brothers, to manage the sexual abuse claims, and the province also includes Papua New Guinea, 10 brothers, national brothers in Papua New Guinea, to manage the small project we're trying to develop there to provide services for homeless psychiatric people in Madang.
Thank
A
you.
very small ministry.
Thank you. Now, brother, have you read the data report?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Now, the data in relation to the St John of God brothers indicated that, taking into account duration of ministry, of those who ministered in the period between 1950 and 2010, 40.4% were the subject of a claim for child sexual abuse. Now, you've heard the question I put to the other members of the panel as to, in each of their own cases, what reflections they've had about the experience of their order. Would you like
I mean,
to
I have a personal reflection that I think mirrors the feelings of the brothers, and such figures are quite heartbreaking for us. Heartbreaking that a small number of our members have criminally offended against vulnerable children, and the brothers live with the shame of that each and every day. That's my personal reflection, and the reflection of the brothers as to why. Most of the factors that the previous witnesses have spoken about would come into our situation. But I think additionally for us, institutions that were working with people with challenging life issues, whether that were government institutions or other non-government institutions, particularly back before the 1980s, were very closed communities. They were put on islands or put outside town. And the very closed nature of those communities, I think, encouraged cultures that weren't conducive for safe places. I believe that as services like ours opened up in the 70s and 80s, lay people began more and more to be involved in service delivery. Lay people, and particularly women, began to take more responsibility for the management and governance of those services. The culture's changed. And I think that's also reflected in, if you look at across the decades, how there was a tremendous plummet in the reporting of claims, particularly from the 90s onwards.
Are there any of the features that have been highlighted by the other witnesses in relation to their orders which you would say aren't applicable to St John?
I think they're all applicable. There was virtually no assessment of people coming in. I think it was an attitude of numbers over quality. It was about trying to develop up a workforce. Very poor psychosexual or non-existent psychosexual formation of young people. Very little supervision. People were asked to do things they weren't adequately trained for. They weren't supported in what were often very difficult ministries. And so all of those factors come together to create the catastrophes that happened.
One needs to be a little bit careful about the statistics and reporting closer to today's date. Do you understand that? I mean, the time for the reports that we've collected is way beyond 20 years.
Yes.
But this is a question really for all of you. An outsider to your church would find what you just said, undoubtedly with some substance, remarkable. And that is that the people who dedicated their lives to service failed until the laity emerged amongst them to assist and lead the project. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
How could it be that those who'd given their lives to service failed until the laity arrived to help?
I suppose I see that as a really positive thing. And I guess it's probably reflecting a change in the Church's understanding of itself as I see it, particularly post-Vatican II.
What does the laity bring that the ordained and religious brothers failed to bring?
I think in the early days they probably brought better training. They probably brought with them experience beyond the one institution. They probably brought with them a sense of relationship coming out of their families. In our case, very often many of our lay people were women who were mothers, particularly in residential settings. All of that contributed, I think, to a change in culture. Maybe
Anyone else have a perspective here?
Perhaps a simplistic view is that the advent of the laity, in that sense, broke the secrecy situation to the extent that people had to become more responsible to a wider group of people, and in that sense, I also believe that there's a significant difference in the experience of the 20th century in terms of the whole culture of sexual mores, which showed a development at the same time, not necessarily parallel, but certainly seems to be at least worth looking at. The Commission has had some very instructive contributions in terms of the causes of this. I think it's also instructive to look at this issue of the drop-off of sexual abuse as it's reflected in the statistics, and I believe that can be, at least there can be a proposition put forward that there's a whole relationship between the subculture of the religious life and the wider cultures operating in the general community. It's an area which I believe merits some further investigation.
But brother, sexually abusing a child is a crime.
There's no way in sexual abuse of a child is a crime, and any sexual abuse of any one child is a crime. I'm not trying to excuse it, but the question was how do we explain the question as I understood the question? As I understood the question was to say that in terms of causation, there's a concomitant variation between the advent of laity and the drop-off in sexual abuse. Now,
yes, but you put the proposition that the mores of the community allowed or in some way contributed to priests and religious abusing. And that's difficult to accept given that it was always a crime.
I wasn't addressing the question that it was a crime, and I take the reservation on it. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Just one comment that I know that the religious communities were enclosed. And, for example, I know in our congregation you had externs, we used to call them when I was younger, and they weren't to come into the brother's house. There's always a parlour in which you entertained any extern, as we called it. And it formed a closed community. And I believe with the coming of laity, that closure, which was unhealthy, I believe, and secrecy that went with it, was broken. And I think that was healthy, and that's what the oncoming of laity brought. I think a greater openness, and for me it came to that there was a greater understanding of the needs of the day. We were attuned more with the needs of society as it changed into the future.
So the picture that you would gather from that is that in that closed community, in some way, the propensity for criminal activity was allowed to occur.
Yes.
Why is that?
Yes. Well, I know some people find it difficult to understand, Your Honour, but individual brothers would not have known that another brother was abusing a child.
I understand that, but why were the brothers abusing at all? Why is it that in a closed community this propensity is revealed?
Well, my attempt to answer that question would be in the vetting and the initial formation. There was some predisposed towards pedophilia that was not picked up. And the experience in a closed community where only brothers taught, there seemed to be secrecy was able to happen. And those offences happened. It wasn't vetted out well.
Sorry, could I just ask Brother Graham if you might explain so that others understand, the nature of your services were quite different to many of the other orders, which were largely schools. Can you just describe the nature of those facilities and also the categorisation of those who were offended against?
We ran a school in Melbourne, which started off in Cheltenham in the 1950s and transferred to Greensborough around about 1967. Originally, that school in Melbourne would have been working with boys with learning disabilities. That later transferred itself into working with children with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities. Particularly in the 90s, the school closed in 1990 because of the change in government policy around funding residential special schools in Victoria. That service was then transferred into working with young people with disabilities, which continues today. Additional factor of that school in Melbourne, where I worked as a younger brother, was we were dealing with children with quite severe behavioural problems as well as intellectual disabilities. The school in Morisset near Newcastle similarly would have worked originally with boys with learning disabilities. It would have then evolved into working with boys with more severe intellectual disabilities, maybe mid-range. It then transferred into a school trying to meet the needs as they were arising at the time of boys with emotional behavioural disorders, which was a very difficult work. It then transferred into a service of early intervention, working with children between the ages of 6 and 10 and their families around parent effectiveness training. And that school closed in 2000, again as a result of changes in government funding of residential special schools. So we don't currently operate, well, we don't auspice or govern any services, but we haven't run schools since 2000.
And therefore the preponderance of those that were victims would be children with had either special needs or disabilities and or other forms of impairments.
And hence our heartbreak and our shame.
Thank you.
Brother Graham, could I just ask, did you accept the figure that Mr Free mentioned to you of approximately 40%?
Yes, 40.4% of brothers have had a claim made against them, yes.
Yes, did I understand you correctly in your evidence? I thought you said that a small number of our members?
Oh, well, in terms of those brothers that have actually offended, as opposed to those who've had claims made against them, yes.
Could you explain that more for us?
Well, our forensic investigation of the data suggests that we believe we have 9 brothers who have offended, 4 other brothers whom we can't make a real, what's the word I'm looking for? We can't make a designation because they're deceased and have been deceased for some time. Of those 9 we believe are offenders, 4 are deceased, 4 are no longer members of the order and haven't been members of the order for quite some time, and we have 1 current member of the order who's currently serving a sentence.
Is it a fair comment to say, though, that if you accept the figure of 40%, then that doesn't fit with a statement that it was a small number of our members?
Yeah, I'd accept that small was probably a bad choice of words.
Thank you.
Brother Graham, one matter you referred to in your statement was that at the end of, or it may not have been the end, sorry, but in 2016 you engaged consultants, Mind and Matter Consulting, to review the cognitive capacity of your members because of a particular concern you had that with age and potentially dementia there might be a professional standards risk.
That Mind and Matter had 2 roles. The first one was to assess the psychological well-being of the brothers, given both the ageing process and the fact that as a community of religious we've been dealing with this issue of sexual abuse for the last 25 years. The second part of that was to do a cognitive assessment of the brothers, given their advanced age, to determine whether there are any signs of dementia or other issues that are occurring with them. That was a very positive process, and it's actually led to many of the older brothers engaging in ongoing counselling and supervision and spiritual direction. So that's been positive.
Did it identify any professional standards, risk management issues that you needed to address?
I was interested in the area of dementia, whether any of the brothers were exhibiting some prodromal signs of dementia, because there is a suggestion that with dementia, disinhibition can occur. The outcome was that none of the brothers are exhibiting, well, I tell a lie, one brother is exhibiting signs of perhaps beginning the dementing process.
Thank you. You mentioned supervision. Now, is it the case that brothers, whether they're engaged in external or internal ministry, are required to have regular professional supervision?
I think as best practice, I would encourage all brothers, given the limitations of their age or their health, to engage in some sort of spiritual direction, some sort of opportunity to therapeutically engage with a relevant professional.
And is that something that occurs at the moment?
Yes, absolutely.
Who provides that?
It's provided by Mind and Matter, and some brothers go to their own independent professionals.
Thank you.
As do I. I go to an independent psychologist, and I also have a spiritual director.
Thank you. And I think you've also mentioned group sessions.
Yes, the leadership team has group supervision once a month.
How long has that practice been?
We've been doing that group supervision of the leadership team, maybe for 3 years perhaps.
Thank you. Now, in relation to the management of brothers who've been identified as offenders, either through a criminal process or through some other process, you've indicated in your statement that the overriding principle informing the province's policies and procedures is that keeping brothers within the province is best practice in ensuring supervisory parameters.
Mm-hmm. I was very interested to read the transcript of Dr. Geraldine Robinson's testimony the other day, which I agree with. From my point of view, I think it's our social responsibility to ensure that these individuals have some supervisory parameters put around them. And my expectation would be, particularly someone who has served a criminal sentence, is that they would need to have a forensic assessment once a year. They would need to go to supervision at least once a month. They would need to have regular community contact. They would need to attend all the province formation activities. I think this issue, and it was mentioned it was asked in my witness statement about isolation. I think social isolation may be one of the biggest risk factors for people reoffending. So from my perspective, I think we are being responsible to the community to try and put some parameters around these individuals. Ex-brothers, I have no authority over them in order to insist that they engage in certain principles.
Do you have anything in the nature of the safety and wellbeing plans which the Morris brothers have?
We have a wellbeing plan, yes, that are currently being reviewed they're reviewed every 12 to 18 months.
So does that contain obligations on the part of the person, the offender, if I can call them that, in terms of committing to supervision and other things?
Well, based on the figures I stated before, our offenders are either have left or are dead.
So you've got none in there?
We have one offender who's in jail at the moment, and those principles would be applied to him once he's released, and he has many more years to serve yet.
Have you given any thought to the model which I explored with the other witnesses earlier of people being stripped effectively of their membership of the order and of their title, but have been otherwise kept in the community life and provided material assistance, etc.?
I guess the issue I'd have with that is if they're no longer part of the order, I don't have any canonical authority over them. They're basically laymen living in the community. I can't insist that they have an annual forensic assessment, psychiatric assessment. I could suggest and I could ask, but I can't insist in terms of their canonical responsibilities around obedience to do that.
You could make it a condition of providing them with money?
Yeah, absolutely. I could make it a condition of providing them with a roof over their heads. But if they refuse to do that, my only option is to not provide a roof over their heads. And you go back into the problem of no supervision, social isolation, no appropriate relationships that are going to encourage appropriate behaviour, etc., etc. So that's the bind.
Yes. Does your order have a policy in relation to providing financial assistance in criminal defence?
Yes, we do not provide financial assistance to ex-members, and as I indicated, we've had one criminal process that ended in failure. We did support that, and I guess our position would be to support that. Again, it's a bind. Do you provide the finances so that the person can have a just trial, or do you use up scarce legal aid resources? That's the bind.
One particular matter which was the subject of some criticism by Professor Parkinson in a paper he's written, which is in material before the Commission, concerned a brother who was being extradited to New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that?
Yes,
episode? I would. And did St John of God fund his criminal defence?
They did.
And I think Professor Parkinson was particularly critical of extradition being resisted. Yes. Is that what occurred?
I remember my predecessor was responsible for this. Again, it caused great controversy. The provincial at the time virtually got on his knees and begged the individual to go to New Zealand to speak to the police, but his independent legal advice was not to do that.
And so the result was that the provincial supported him in his legal strategy of resisting the extradition.
Well, I guess, this individual was entitled to his independent legal advice, which he chose to take. As I say, I'm speaking secondhand. Yes. I wasn't involved in that. This is some 10, 12 years ago, I think, from memory. And it would have been better if the individual had have done as the provincial asked and gone to New Zealand and spoke to the police.
Professor Parkinson, in his article, cites this as an example of a cultural problem, that he was comparing it with a commercial organisation, and he was saying it's unimaginable that an Australian bank would fight or assist one of its managers to resist extradition to New Zealand. Do you have any comment on that observation?
In hindsight, I think it would have been better for the provincial at the time not to have done that.
Thank you.
And as I say, that particular individual is deceased, and he can't comment on that.
Thank you, Bill. Father Chambers, can I turn to you, please? Can you state your full name?
Gregory George Chambers.
Thank you. And you're the provincial of the Australian Pacific province of the Salesians?
I am, yes. Just to clarify, that consists of Australia, New Zealand, Samoa and Fiji.
Thank you. Father, you provided a statement to the Royal Commission on the 30th, or dated the 30th of September 2016.
Yes, I did.
Is that statement true and correct?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us, please, about what the present activities of the Salesians in Australia are?
Yes, there are approximately 77 Salesians in the Australia sector of the province. Some are still involved in schools as rectors of the communities, as board members, a few teachers and chaplains. Others are involved in parishes throughout Australia. There are 7 parishes. There are 2 youth centres. There's 1 retreat centre, 1 hostel and 1 camp. We're involved in schools that are order-owned and in other schools that are part of dioceses but operate under the Salesian charism or spirit.
And what's the governance structure for those schools?
Which particular schools?
First, starting with the order-owned schools.
The order-owned schools come under myself as provincial and my provincial council. There are 2 order-owned schools in Melbourne and 1 order-owned school in Hobart and Tasmania. And there's the Dunley Centre, which is an updated name for Australia's original boys' town in Engadine, New South Wales, which also comes under myself as provincial and the provincial council.
Thank you. So with those institutions that you've described that come under you as provincial and your provincial council, the governance of those institutions is effectively all by members of the order? Is that right?
No, not entirely, because each of those schools would have a board of its own with an independent chair. And, of course, the principal, who would be a lay principal in those schools, would take his place. And then you would have a mixture of a parish priest, parent representatives, usually 2 college captains, past pupil representatives, and so on. You would have one solution, normally the rector of the community, representing the solution provincial on that board of that school.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned care of parishes, I think 7 of them. Is that by arrangement with the diocese in those particular places?
Very much so. In all cases, we were invited by the bishop or the archbishop of the diocese and archdiocese to take over the running of the parish on behalf of the local ordinary, and we do so in a delegated authority to him. And of course, the Salesians who are involved in those parishes follow the governance structures and directives of the bishop or archbishop of the day.
Now, in terms of your role as provincial, you have a provincial council to assist you, is that right?
That's right. Myself, and there's 5 members that represent Australia and the Pacific on that council. We meet once a month to look at various province issues and sort of things going forward. So we keep up very much with the administration of our province and in Australia and the Pacific. It should be mentioned that we are beholden, of course, to the Rector Major of the Salesians in Rome and his General Council.
So do you report regularly to the Rector Major on matters happening in Australia?
Yes, very much so. I guess in many ways, even though we're a reasonably young religious order compared to others, we're very much a top-down religious order, very hierarchical. The Rector Major and General Council in Rome rule the whole congregation, including our province, and want various reports and accountabilities back. They members of the General Council, some of whom are regional councillors. So we have a councillor appointed for East Asia, Oceania by our Rector Major, who is the go-between between him and myself and the Provincial Council. And it's a pretty tight ship from the point of view of accountabilities in terms of back to our centre in Rome.
In terms of local accountability, aside from the Provincial Council, are there any other structures in place that provide you with assistance or a measure of accountability for what you're doing?
Well, each of our communities in Australia and the Pacific has their own rector and house council, made up of key members of that community that have to report back on a regular basis to the provincial and his council. For example, if they put forward any proposals for buildings or change of ministry or employment of various people, they've got to put that proposal to the Provincial Council for its final acceptance.
But in terms of accountability for your decisions as provincial, are there any other bodies that effectively you're accountable to?
Well, I suppose in all senses, I'm accountable to bishops and archbishops in whose diocese we work. I'm accountable to the Catholic education officers in which our schools are based, and I'm accountable to government and non-government authorities for youth centres, hostels, camps and other organisations that come under particular aspects of state and Commonwealth governments. So in many senses, I'm accountable in various types of different works to different government and non-government authorities.
Now, Father, if I could just turn to the data that has been compiled in relation to the Salesians. Now, taking into account duration of ministry, the data report concludes that 21.9% of Salesians who ministered between 1950 and 2010 were the subject of a claim of child sexual abuse. Now, you must have reflected on those numbers.
Yeah, I have, and the numbers and percentages are horrendous. There's no doubt about that. They're inexcusable and indefensible. More so due to the fact that the Salesians were established in the 1850s to educate and care for poor and abandoned and at-risk young men in various types of institutions around the world. Clearly, we've betrayed those young men and their families. We've also, I think, betrayed St John Bosco, who founded the order, to gather around him groups of religious who would carry on his work of caring for young people that nobody else cared for at the particular time. This is the essence of our ministry and vocation. And obviously many members of our province have failed in carrying out that sacred ministry and mandate. So it's a real serious betrayal of the highest order from my point of view and from the point of view of my fellow Salesians in this province, and also from the point of view of our Rector Major and General Council in Rome and other provinces around the world, that in a sense we've let them down grievously, but not to the extent that we've let the victims themselves down, unfortunately.
Father, in terms of trying to understand whether there are any particular features of the order or its history that might explain the betrayal that you've described, you've heard what's been said by the other witnesses about their own orders. Firstly, are there any aspects of what they've described that you would disagree with in terms of their application to the Salesians?
No, I'd have to say I agree with them all. There are elements of those in the Salesians as well. But I have reflected upon this from a couple of points of view. St John Bosco founded the Salesians not to be strict disciplinarians or system or order conscious, but on the foundation of reason, religion and loving kindness. And what went with the loving kindness was fellowship and friendliness, familiarity, family spirit, all of those things that would be the right thing and the right ingredients, he thought, for the care and upbringing of young people who had been deprived of these elements themselves because of their own orphan background or lack of a family structure. I think that the lack of order and discipline in our order, particularly that here in Australia, and a propensity to be over-familiar and to break down the boundaries and restrictions built into our constitutions are one of the things that led the Salesians, many of them, to enter on this cycle of abuse to the young people, because these boundaries and restrictions weren't adhered to. It was a faulty and a very lax interpretation of the philosophy of our founder. Secondly, and I come back to my own case, many of the young men recruited into the Salesians in the 50s and 60s, I was one of them in the 60s, we came straight out of school. I just turned 17. There were some younger than I was. We went into the novitiate without any life experience of the world, without any chance to grow in maturity, relationships, or adult values and attitudes. We, I think, recruited willy-nilly often into the Salesians at an early stage, and we proceeded upon the lines of formation to final profession, diaconate and priesthood without proper training and formation. So much so, just a couple of statistics. I started in a novitiate of 11. There's only 3 of us left. The novitiate before me, there were 10. The last one of those 10 left about 15 years ago. So I think there was a very rash and haphazard selection and vetting of young Salesians, some of whom advanced along the various offices without being properly vetted or advised or guided at any time, and I think a large number of those fell into abuse and paedophilia and very negative tendencies without being brought to task or brought to book about certain tendencies or attitudes or behaviours. I think somehow we lost our way in the production line of young Salesians coming through. I think with the idea of trying to build up our numbers in the province, we're a very small province, trying to build up our identity as a province that could be looked up to and admired for, perhaps for their progress and stability in terms of the wider Salesian congregation. And we just didn't have the necessary skills, perhaps, the training, the qualifications, the wherewithal to follow the Salesian vocation and call as it should have been followed. And I think a lot of Salesians, both young, middle-aged and old, fell into these difficulties and sins and crimes because of a lack of sufficient grounding, training, experience and advice and guidance and accompaniment along the way. So that's, I know, a rather long answer, but an important one.
Thank you, Father. Just to understand the picture with formation today, how many candidates do you tend to have from year to year present themselves to the Salesians?
Well, for quite a while there in Australia, we, the 80s and 90s, very few candidates, hardly any inquiries. But in recent times, we've had a couple of local Australian vocations that are going through practical training at the moment. We've recently sent one Australian candidate to novitiate in Suva, but he's of Vietnamese background. He joins a novitiate of 5 Pacifican candidates, 4 from Samoa, 1 from Fiji. So we've got 6 in the novitiate this year. So we've had a steady flow of candidates for religious life and the priesthood, mainly because of the affiliation of those specific countries that have supplied the greater bulk of prospective Salesians over the past 2 decades.
Where do you expect those members of the order to have their ministry when they're finished?
Well, I think they'll basically train in Suva and in the Pacific, and they'll exercise their ministry in Samoa, Fiji and New Zealand. On the 1st of January this year, with the support of the Rector Matron Council, we established the Pacific, 3 Pacific countries and the 20 or so Salesians working there as an independent delegation in their own right. In time, they will become a vice province, and in time, depending upon numbers and financial viability, they may well become a separate province from Australia in their own right. But obviously that's where the growth in numbers and ministry is occurring for us at the moment, and that's probably true of a lot of Australian-based orders.
Do you anticipate importing Salesians to ministry in Australia?
I suppose that process is going on. The Salesians being a worldwide order, we've got strong growth in Salesian provinces in East Asia, Oceania, in Southern Asia, mostly India. So a number of those Salesians come out usually on a 3-year transfer to work in our province for those 3 years. We ensure that they go through the proper certification of police checks in their own countries, working with children checks, various training before they come out here, the usual statement of church authorities, declarations, etc., before they come. Occasionally you might have a situation where 1 or 2 of those in time might decide to join our province on a permanent basis, thus raising the number of more experienced men in our own province.
When you were describing a few minutes ago what you had concluded to be some of the past problems that might explain the prevalence of abuse, you emphasised inadequate preparation, in particular poor formation. Do you have a view about whether members of the order being formed today, including overseas, are having a better experience in being formed for the order?
I think they're having a tangibly better experienced, a more well-balanced experience, a far more extensive and thorough experience than any of us could have possibly dreamed of in our time. There is various testing and criteria for selection and taking of temporary vows and final vows and applications for diaconate and priesthood. There are serious testing and investigations along the way, and by the time between when they join the aspirantate pre-novitiate and when they're ordained, it's the best part of 11 or 12 years, during which time a lot of them leave us and some are asked to leave us because they're found not suitable for the mission among the young to whom we've dedicated ourselves. So there's a strong vetting process, not simply at the start, but all the way through, including supervision after final profession, supervision after ordination, etc. I can't say that we've got the system perfectly right now, but it's light years away from the system that operated in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I believe.
What's the system of supervision after ordination and final profession?
Well, there's a system in place within the Catholic Church for a newly ordained priest, quinquennium, which is a very strong supervisory thrust for 5 years after they're ordained. I considered this, and in a number of cases we prolonged that, but also lay brothers who took final profession, we felt that they needed 5 or so years training and formation like the young priests, so they've been asked to join them for that 5-year period, even though canonically we didn't have to do it, etc. Carrying on for them, they're instructed to spiritual direction, annual retreats, regular sabbaticals and so on, to allow them to undergo ongoing formation as the term goes on in the years to come. Again, that wasn't always a regular practice with people my age, but it is now increasingly with those professed and ordained in this present day and age.
Do you have supervision as the provincial?
I have some sporadic supervision, but not as regular as some of my peers have. But I've honestly taken a leaf out of their book today and realised that myself and the provincial councillors as leaders need that ongoing supervision as well.
You've described in your statement some of the policies that are applied in relation to professional standards and child protection. Yes. One of those is the Salesians Child Protection Policy of August 2015.
Yes.
Now that has also, or another development which has happened is the appointment of a child safeguarding officer. When did that occur?
That occurred in 2015 also. If I could just mention that I asked a particular Salesian priest to assist me in professional standards matters to establish that role, and also other elements of compliance. I think he's done a tremendous job in establishing that role of child safeguarding officer and department. However, we plan from the beginning of next year to have a full-time layperson, professional, highly qualified, as so many other orders and dioceses done. So we will hire that person to take over from that establishment phase and to really bed down our child protection policies and documents, and to regularly visit all our schools and centres to make sure that they are compliant with that national policy, and also have in place and fully endorse their own local policies that underpin and support that.
Now, Father, you've made this comment in your statement in relation to the policy. You've said, as all aspects of the policy and procedures are implemented and known, their effectiveness depend greatly on trust and goodwill. To offset any erosion of the climate of trust and confidence, it is necessary to schedule regular in-service sessions with all staff and volunteers so that a high level of standards and expectations is maintained. The goodwill and commitment of all involved in the Salesian mission is an essential ingredient of this process and will be monitored at all times. So obviously one element of what you're describing there is a particular practice, having regular in-service sessions. But you also seem to be alluding to a cultural element that is needed. Can you just tell us what, particularly from your perspective as a leader of the community, how you see or what steps need to be taken to embed that culture of trust and goodwill?
Well, I think all Salesians need to undergo regular professional training, regular professional development in all aspects of ministry, but particularly in terms of child protection. But not only them, but all lay people working in our many schools and centres need to undergo that training and formation on a regular basis. I'm in contact with many of our schools and centres to ensure that they not only observe the policies, but have got these professional training of all their members, Salesian and non-Salesian, up and running. Some of them need to be further developed and strengthened in the years ahead, but I'm confident we've made a reasonable start in that direction. I find particularly of great assistance are the lay principals and lay directors of our various works who seem to have a much greater appreciation and instant conception of the things that need to be done with their particular staffs and colleagues in this regard. It's almost instinctive for lay professionals, whereas for Salesians and other religious, it's not instinctive at all, it seems to me. It seems to need to be learned and assimilated. But for our lay leaders, who have done an excellent job in our various centres, it's instinctive to not only give professional development to themselves, but to all members of their community, including the Salesians who work under them.
What do you put that down to, the different instincts of the two groups you're describing?
Well, I think, going back to it, I think our lay leaders have had not only a greater life experience, especially in their own careers and studies, but also with bringing up their own children and families. They have a more instinctive concept of what children and young people require of the adults in charge of them. They have a greater appreciation of their sense of mission and vocation to continue the Salesian charism and mission in the school, to make sure it's not lost but strengthened. I think in many senses, if I could use the word, they're more fanatical about embedding the Salesian spirit and charism as it's meant to be than some of the Salesians were, who just took things for granted, perhaps, and just assumed that they were going to happen, rather than making them happen with proper programs and regular and consistent approaches. I think we've got a lot to learn from our lay men and lay women in these positions of leadership in our schools and in our various province commissions. We have a lot of female and male lay leaders who are members of our province commissions, Commission for Young People, commissions for education, commissions for finance, you name it. We have the lay people involved.
Father Chambers, are you saying that lay people who act for you in the various functions you've described are better for having relationships and families and are more capable of functioning because they're not celibate? Is that what you've just said to us?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily put it like that, but what I'm saying is because they've had that married and family and child-raising experience, that close contact with the family unit and what children and families and partners and their fellow lay people require to be effective, well-balanced individuals in society, because they've got that instinctive grasp of what is required, in Don Bosco's terminology, to be good Christians and honest citizens in the world today. In many ways, they are better leaders in our centres and better animators of our spirit and charism and identity than many of the Salesians with whom and for whom they work.
That still sounds to me as if you've just said that not being forced to be celibate is helpful to lay people.
Well, it's certainly helpful to lay people, but I know you've linked this point of view to celibacy. However, I have not necessarily made that link myself.
What you are saying, though, is that, as I understand it, the life of a brother denies the development of that person in a way which society otherwise would allow them to develop, and thus confines their capacity for a positive contribution to the work you do. Is that right?
Yes, in some senses, look at it two ways. I mean, most religious orders, their members are bound by not simply celibacy, but by the vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. Now, it could be concluded from this that celibacy, poverty, chastity and obedience restrict and inhibit the individual from his own personal growth and blossoming and development. The Church and other religious orders would believe that these very same vows are the possibility and the opportunity for real human growth. The person who takes chastity should be free and available to minister to all people and not simply one spouse and one family. It doesn't always work out like this, but in taking these vows, it frees up the individual to give himself completely to God, completely to others, and completely to his fellow religious in the mission entrusted to them. So as you can see, the vows and celibacy can be interpreted in a restrictive role, but they can also be interpreted in an open and flourishing and role which permits the individual and those for whom he works to grow in understanding and maturation. So it depends on which way you take it.
I'm a little lost now, Father, because however you describe it, there will be a reality that invades the space. However you choose to describe it doesn't mean it'll end up there.
No, it doesn't.
What will end up there is just the way human beings develop and respond. And you started this proposition by putting forward an analysis which, I have to say to you, and you'd be aware of this, is at odds with a lot of what we hear from church people.
Well, if it is at odds, so be it. But in religious life, you've got all sorts of possibilities for growth, maturity, and all the rest of it that some members take up to the full. Some members might do in a mediocre, half-hearted manner. Some who choose not to grow at all. But I suppose in an accompanying way, all those who entered into married and family life, many of these unions and relationships work out well, but not all of them work out perfectly either.
That may be true, but the experience itself would, of course, enrich that person's capacity in the general world.
Yes.
I understand you to be saying.
Yes, well, and I agree with that principle that, and I'm sure some of my colleagues have got various other arguments for involving lay people in our religious orders and their works, and in the diocese and archdiocese, and in the Catholic Church. I think there are greater possibilities for lay leadership and involvement in all those areas, and many of those remain untapped and unfulfilled. And it's up to the leadership of the Church and religious orders to tap in to that vast lay potential men and women to assist the Church and the orders in becoming what they were always meant to become.
Father Chambers, do the Salesians have a policy about how to deal with brothers who've been either convicted of abuse or who you've found through other processes to have committed abuse?
Yes, I've been thinking over my answer to that question as you've asked it to others. The Salesians, as many people may well know, have had a number of very well publicised cases of offenders in recent times, all of them priests as far as I know, that have been charged and convicted and sentenced to custodial terms because of sexual abuse. We don't attempt to hide from this in any way. the thing to note in our case is that all these were priest members who have committed crimes against young people. And according to canon law, priests in this position really need to be put into a process of dismissal from the priesthood and religious life and eventually defrocking from the priesthood. In terms of priest members here, it's pretty clear for the Salesians and other priestly orders, and we're mainly a priestly orders with some lay brothers, that we don't have an alternative in this regard. So they really must be dismissed and must enter in a process from this province to our rector major, then passed on to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then passed on to the Pope. This process can take years, but eventually the outcome must be dismissal. So we haven't really got an alternative to keep members on in a sort of a third or unofficial capacity. That's not to say that we completely cut our ties with people in jail. We, as provincial, myself and some councillors, keep in contact with them. We keep in contact when they come out of prison to ensure that they've at least got a basic wherewithal to survive in life. We assist them through some accommodation and help and accompaniment to subsist in one form or other after sentencing. Mind you, we do so usually at the request of the members. A number of members who have been through the prison system decide to go their own separate ways and do not remain in contact with us.
For those that do remain in contact, and you've described making sure they've at least got basic wherewithal, do you impose any conditions on that in terms of supervision or anything else?
Well, we ask that they remain in reasonably regular contact. We try to accommodate them. Well, our province centre is in Melbourne. We try to accommodate them somewhere in Melbourne, well away from children, etc., to remain in contact so that we can ensure that they are not a menace to society, to children or themselves, so that they will not self-harm, will not reoffend, and we do this for the health and well-being of them and the general society.
Thank you, Father. And I've asked some of the others. I think I've overlooked a couple. I'll have to come back. But have the Salesians formed a view about whether they will opt in to the Commonwealth's redress scheme?
Most definitely. We've been in favour of this concept since we became aware of it. So we'll become full members of that.
Thank you. Brother Graham, I think I neglected to ask you that.
Yes.
Has St John of God formed a view about opting in to the redress
I think
scheme?
it'll provide a very important further alternative for victims to choose from, and we would be most prepared to be part of that.
Thank you. Brother Payne, I think I might have overlooked asking you that. Has the De La Salle brothers formed a view about opting in?
It's a decision of the trustees of the District Council. Current position is that we support definitely the idea of a national redress scheme. We're apprehensive about any propositions that suggest that be segmented into state schemes or similar situations. We're particularly impressed by the comprehensiveness of the report on the redress and civil litigation, and our only concerns are what will happen when politicians, bureaucrats, and vested interests take part in the next step.
Thank you, brother. Father McCoy, can I turn to you finally, please? And thank you for your patience. Can you state your full name?
Brian Francis McCoy.
Thank you. And before I forget, have the Jesuits formed a position on the National Redress Scheme?
We're very supportive of everything you're trying to do in that area. We think it provides an instrument outside of us that people can trust in. So we support it.
Thank you. Now, Father, you provided a statement dated the 15th of October 2016.
Yep.
Are the contents of that statement true and correct?
They are.
Thank you, Father. Now, you're the provincial of the Australian province of the Society of Jesus?
That's correct, yep.
How long have you been the provincial?
2.5 years.
Thank you. And now, you entered the Society of Jesus in 1966, is that right?
That's correct.
And you were how old then?
18.
And you were ordained in 1977?
Yes.
And you took your final vows as a Jesuit in 1986?
That's correct.
Now, can you tell the Commissioners, please, what the present activities of the members of the Jesuits in Australia are?
It's about 125 members of the province. 25% are over the age of 80, 75% are over the age of 60. We currently have responsibility for 5 schools, 9 parishes in 5 states, I think it is, 5 centres for Ignatian spirituality, 4 social centres or ministries. We worked in formation. We have 1 university college in Melbourne, and we do publishing, and we have a provincial office. So it's about 25 ministries all up.
Thank you. So of those activities, is it only through the schools and the parishes that the Jesuits would have regular contact with children?
Probably, I would think so. I mean, maybe in some of the social ministries through families and so on, but Jesuit Refugee Service would involve families, I would think. So yes, there would be some involvement with children, I think.
Thank you. Now, what's the governance structure of the schools that you're involved with?
We're presently restructuring our governance structure in the schools, so we're going to incorporate our schools, and we're in the process of doing that this year, very soon we hope. And that will have a structure where each council and board will take responsibility for the life of that school. But over above that will be a probably called Jesuit Education Australia, which will be responsible for the values and the principles, and in this context, certainly professional standards, which will be uniform across all those schools.
Now, have you read the Commission's data report?
Yes.
Now, in relation to Jesuits, the overall statistics in relation to claims suggest a relatively low number compared with some of the other orders. Is that your assessment?
Any number's terrible.
Yes. Now, there's been a number of things said today about reflections of your colleagues on what might have caused abuse to occur within their orders. Is there anything you'd like to either add to that or suggest is less applicable in the case of the Jesuits?
I think around the time of the 60s and 70s, which has been a part of the discussion, we were largely infantilised. In other words, the structure of the church and formation was semi-monastic. It was very tight. It wasn't listening to a lot of the social sciences until the early 70s. And so people grew up very immature. They came in immature. The screening processes weren't tight or clear. There were a large number of seminarians in the 60s, so there was a great influx of people into seminaries in the 60s. It was after the Second World War where there was an influx of migrant groups, but a sense that the church was growing. So it started way back then, I think, with selection processes. Formation processes were very tight and narrow. And it was only later that people started to break out of that with not just Vatican II, but the whole social revolution that we were caught up in broke us out of that narrow world, and a lot of us weren't equipped to deal with it.
Now, in terms of formation, as it relates to the Jesuits, have there been improvements to mean that those coming out of formation in more recent years are better prepared for life?
I think we've made a number of significant changes in formation over the last few years, especially the initial candidate program. So we don't accept people straight from school anymore, like most other congregations wouldn't. So there's a candidate program and sort of monitoring of their development. And then before they come, a much more rigorous psychosexual analysis that has to be carefully screened. That has to come first, and I think we're much clearer that if that opens up other issues, then they need to be followed through, so we don't rush to accept someone until these issues have been resolved. I think the Kairos program, which our novices undergo, which is with other novices in Sydney, is very formative. It's over time, and the psychosexual areas and development there, psychosocial as well. And then in our formation, we're much more attentive to the reflection on different experiences in the formation period. So part of our tradition, really it's a long tradition of the Society of Jesus, is that in the novitiate, which goes for 2 years, people have experiences which they're sent out cross-culturally, with the dying, with the poor, and they are then mentored in that and called to reflect on that, on how they're coping with that. So I think we're much more rigorous on that. We're much more rigorous on this, between different stages of formation. We will seek information about that person confidentially from lay people and Jesuit, and that'll come to the provincial and the consultors. And we're much more aware of the need to red flag issues, address issues before allowing someone to go to the next stage of formation. Where we're also a bit different is that we have an annual manifestation of conscience with the provincial, with each member of the province. That's a tradition in the Society of Jesus throughout the world. So every year I will speak for at least 1 hour with each member of the province, and that gives me the permission and the authority to ask hard questions of those people. And then out of that, while there is a certain sense of confidentiality in that, I will act on certain things if I need to in terms of formation or issues. And it also means that you don't appoint people to places where they will be under stress or can't cope. The other area where we're different is that we don't have final vows before ordination. So we will, again, seek information to ordain someone, we'll ordain that person, and then 5 or 6 years later, they will go into a tertianship program, which is many throughout the world, and that's, again, they'll be looking at more deeply the 3 vows and how they're living them and their community life and so forth. So the steps have been there for a long time, but I think the quality of them has also improved.
Father, you said that in the 50s and 60s that Jesuits, and I take it you apply this generally to brothers, were infantilised. That's what you said.
Yes, that's what I said.
Now, is it right to think that the processes which led to them being, in your term, infantilised were part of the traditional church processes going back decades, if not centuries?
I think there's some evidence for that, yes. And people didn't change them, didn't reflect on them, and they hadn't caught up with society, which was changing a lot, as we know, at that time. So,
as I said to Brother Payne, I'm not sure how one gets from an infantilised person to a more liberal lay society which allows, causes, enables priests and brothers to commit crimes against children. Can you help me with the logic of that?
I think evidence has come before this commission that people often entered at a certain level of maturity, psychosexual maturity, and then they acted according to that level and never progressed. I think what changed for some of us is that things moved on. We did get out of that world. We went to university. We didn't wear clerical clothes. We met women. We socialised. And for me, it was getting out of the cities and meeting other people and families and so forth. So I think it's about growing up. But I think some didn't grow up and they still acted out of a very immature form of sexuality.
Well, presumably, on that analysis, that's been happening for decades, if not centuries.
It's quite likely, but how much we don't know, how much it was covered up, how much we were ashamed of it and therefore couldn't talk about. I think one of the legacies that probably came out of our Irish tradition is that we did not know how to talk about sexuality. We didn't have language around it. There was shame and secrecy associated with it, and therefore men And so this is a male issue, I think, particularly. Didn't have the confidence to go to other men and talk about it or get help for it. So it was kept under wraps. It was a taboo that no one wanted to talk about, and therefore it was suppressed, and then it was repressed in different ways by people's lives.
And on your analysis, it follows that the liberalisation that you speak of, the opportunity for brothers to mix in general society, education and so on, was in fact not the cause of the abuse of children, but in fact was a safety valve.
I think so, yes.
You do?
Yeah, I think it helped us grow up. Yeah. But I don't think everybody grew up. I think people acted out because they hadn't spoken about it, they hadn't been talked about it. There was no language and conversation about it. I mean, even when it started to come out in the 80s and 90s, we still didn't have the language to understand the depth of this and the importance of it and its impact on survivors. We were quite shamed and secret about it. We didn't have the capacity.
Father McCoy, you've described in your statement a number of steps which have been taken since the Royal Commission started to improve and assess processes within the Jesuits. One set of improvements flowed from the appointment of a consultant in 2014, Dr. Kathleen, is it McKesney or McChesney?
McChesney, yeah.
And she evaluated the existing professional standards and child protection practices. You've said that that report led to a number of recommendations which have either been implemented or in the process of implementation. What's still outstanding?
Well, I think we implemented Polonius, so a digital program to record all our archives. I mean, the problem was that we had some records, some of the schools had records, so now we've got an access to all our records, and the schools have access to their records with us, so there's much clearer transmission. So we need to make sure that continues to work and be transparent and works well. The advisory committee, which we instituted last year, I still think that we need to work better, getting advice of these professionals who are outside of us, they're not Jesuits, and get advice from them in terms of people being dismissed or policies and so on. And of course, probably the major thing is acting out the Australian Childhood Foundation commitment we've made, which is across a whole province for 3 years. That will illuminate for us and articulate for us things that are missing, things we need to improve on, and things we need to enhance across the whole province. And that's going to take 3 years.
Can you just explain, firstly, what the Australian Childhood Foundation is and the nature of your partnership with them?
Well, the Australian Childhood Foundation, as I understand, is an independent organisation that audits and develops policies and principles around child protection across Australia. And I think it came up at the Commission yesterday or the day before in the Northern Territory, I think, Centre Care or Catholic Care, I think. And I know the number of communities in Australia employ them to come in and do an audit and a training program. So what we'll get back from them is hopefully a very high standard of which we need to reach across all our ministries, and everyone in the province who works for us, is employed by us, will need to do this program as well.
And the idea is that you have a partnership for 3 years and seek to extract from them some guidance.
Best practice.
Thank you. Now, you also indicate in your statement that you, in March of 2016, you started reconstituting a professional standards consultative panel.
That's right.
And that's got a combination of lawyers and lay people and also Jesuits, is that right?
There's no Jesuit on it. No.
Right. Now, what's the role of that panel?
Well, by Towards Healing, or by church protocol, I should set something up, and I think we've set up something that is of professional people in the area of sexual abuse and child abuse who are accepted in the society as being experts, both professors and psychiatrists and psychologists, who can advise us around some of the difficult questions we all face, especially with offenders or our policies or areas where I need advice.
a number of these initiatives, Father, are quite recent, the last couple of years or so. Is there any particular reason why it didn't happen earlier?
It's a good question. I think things changed in 2003 when our provincial at the time went on the 7:30 report and said that we were changing our processes from a legal approach to a pastoral approach. I think the provincial after him then instituted the need to review with the Kathleen McChesney report, so that was 13-14. So it has been slow. It is about a cultural shift, not just about making our institutions safe, but seeking best practice for all children to come under our ministries. And I think we are slow doing it, but we are doing it.
Thank you. Now, Father, another couple of changes that you've described in your statement, and these go to the way you manage claims that are brought to the Jesuits. The first is that from April 2016, complainants have been advised that they should obtain preliminary legal advice, and that's funded by the Jesuits. Is that right?
So what we have is when someone contacts us and makes a complaint, we very much seek them to make the decisions around how they wish to deal with the complaint. We offer counselling straight away, and we go to Blue Knot, who have a list of professional people in the area where that person might be who can offer their services. And then they will make a choice, whether they go towards healing, whether they come straight to us for litigation, whether they certainly always say go to the police. I need to stress that. I think going to the police is very important where people feel that there's someone outside of us that they can talk to and turn to. Then when that develops, and if they want to get legal advice, we won't give them a lawyer. We want them to find a lawyer and where they can get good legal advice that supports them through the processes. But it's they need to drive. We want them to drive the process as much as they can, as they wish to.
Now, if they want to get legal advice and you encourage them to get that from an independent source, is that funded by the Jesuits?
It will be funded by the Jesuits, but of course it depends where the process takes and what people wish to do with it and whether that comes out of any final settlement or not. But the important thing is to support the person as soon as they come to us and seek some sort of attention and redress of some issue.
You've also indicated that more recently, as part of that process, the Jesuits have been offering the services of an independent accountant. Can you just explain?
I think we realised a year or so ago that while the pastoral approach was an important one, accompaniment was also important, and there are some situations where people need other support, and we're trying to be open to what the support might mean, and sometimes it's about an accountant or some other form. So counselling is an obvious one, but I think an accountant where finances can be problematic and the budgeting issues, so if that can be a help, we're willing to offer it.
Do you involve yourself personally in the management of claims?
I have a Director of Professional Standards, an ex-Australian police officer, and who's trained. But I'm always open to meeting someone and talking with them if that's what they so wish. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. Depends on them.
Thank you. And Father, in relation to the management of Jesuits who've been found to have committed child sexual abuse either by reason of a criminal conviction or some other process, what's the policy of the Jesuits on managing them?
Because they have been priests and religious, we have encouraged them to seek dismissal. And we've had 4 cases of that. And in the seeking of the dismissal, they have to apply for that through Rome, so it's difficult because they're both a priest and religious. And so it goes through our offices in Rome to the Vatican, and those 4 have been dismissed. One of the things the advisory committee will do is advice about what's the best for each particular person, and that's something we'll continue to monitor in the future, because then we have no legal rights over that person who has been dismissed or sought their own dismissal. But what we try to do is set up an MOU with that person, which is not legally binding, but it's around accommodation, around further counselling, perhaps budgeting, and perhaps some health care and so on, so that we can provide some support, as we know others will support that person in a difficult time of transition, because the average age of those men is 77. So there are serious issues of health and long-term care for them.
What's the policy of the Jesuits in relation to funding criminal defence costs?
We've wrestled with this one. We don't think, because an individual Jesuit doesn't have his own income or superannuation of access to funds, we don't think it's fair to go to legal aid and ask them to do it. So we will fund the initial trial, but we won't fund an appeal if he's found guilty.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honour.
I have some questions, Father McCoy. I was hoping that you could help us with some of your experience working in remote Aboriginal communities. I believe you've had some years of experience in that ministry.
Yes. I think there's a real issue here about men talking about what's really important for them, whether it's Aboriginal men or non-Aboriginal men or religious men, and especially around sexuality. There's the issue of the taboo and the shame and the secrecy of it, and the only way to open that up is for men to find spaces where they can talk to other men. And so I've seen the effects of sexual abuse in remote communities, and I've seen the ripple effect on families of sexual abuse, and it's appalling, it's abhorrent. It's especially where the women are trying to protect the family and look after it. And the only way I've seen through it is for men to start having serious conversations with other men about their own lives and about their failure to take care of children and women and adults. So there's a lot we all need to learn, and I'm grateful to the communities that have taught me so much. But to me, there is a masculine issue here which we need to face.
I just have a couple of questions about some of your experiences, and in particular, we've heard in private sessions from a lot of Aboriginal people, particularly from some smaller remote communities, that there still is a great fear in talking or challenging the church. Do you have any comment about that?
I think people hold a lot of fears about the police, social welfare or community services or whatever it is, and because historically the church had control over a lot of their lives, so who do they go to? My experience is that if people learn to trust, they will talk to people they trust, and that's what we have to encourage. But you're quite right, I think in some places people have not been able to say what they want to say because they hold the priest or the bishop or someone up there, and I think we have to get down off that step and sit with them on the dust and have those conversations.
We heard some evidence in the last few days about some of the perhaps culmination of risk factors that might be present that might then make abuse more likely. And some of those things included unscrutinised trust, a power imbalance, isolation, a lack of supervision, acceptance of less than best practice, and it being a very closed shop or closed community. I would have thought some of those risk factors would have been heightened in some of the remote communities. Would you agree?
Oh, very much so. There isn't often the sophistication of behaviour and conversations around behaviour led by important people. So people can come in that haven't been vetted well, either in schools or parishes or communities, both Aboriginal and other people. And so there isn't that clarity or that sophistication we're talking about here today, where you have policies and the execution of policies. So it can be very loose and careless, what people say, what people do at night, and the influence of alcohol, the influence of loss of boundaries. So it is about people of trust coming in and lifting the standard of behaviour that's expected of everybody, I think.
So do you think, given the heightened, perhaps the heightened risk in some areas, that there is sufficient attention paid to that, either in formation or training or support or supervision for people working in remote communities in religious or church ministries?
I think the further north you get, the more casual we get. I think it's part of the lifestyle, and sometimes it's to do with language and dress and relaxing and alcohol and so on. And I think what I hope will come out of the Commission is very much setting guidelines for everybody in this country, but also will have impact overseas and for other communities, because I think we have not allowed enough ourselves to be transparent and accountable wherever we are. And I think some people get away with it in remote areas.
Do you think there needs to be an additional policy or procedure or code of conduct that is different then for remote communities? that might particularly look at the additional risks or complexities?
If it's run by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, yes. So they make demands on us to lift our game when we come in to work with them. I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you.
Father McCoy, I just have one range of questions for you on reporting. With respect to child sexual abuse, what is your view on priests and religious being mandatory reporters?
Is this in relation to confession?
I'll get there. But I want to deal with the principle first.
I think the principle of confidentiality is very important. I think what trumps it at times is the principle of care for the young and vulnerable. As also, other times you will trump confidentiality if you think person's at risk for self-harm, or you think something else is happening in another community where a person might be attacked or so on. But it comes back to what the Commissioner said, is you want places of safety where people can actually talk about what's happening to themselves, and you don't want to destroy that sense of safety, but you have a responsibility to take it further. And I think we have to learn better to struggle with that tension.
You said something which triggered the question, and you said that you, and it's true of many others, including commissioners, that we know vastly more about the problem of child sexual abuse as a crime, and particularly the damage it does, than we once did. I think you know, and perhaps you could answer, that both Australia and the Vatican are signatories to the Convention on the Right to the Child, which include in it a priority to act in the best interests of the child.
I'm aware of it, but not the details.
All right. Given that we now know that's a commitment, given that we now know the terrible damage done to an individual by child sexual abuse, would you agree that that trumps, if I can use that phrase, that trumps the seal of confidentiality with a confession? Because if a child says that somebody is abusing them, or a perpetrator says that they're abusing a child, the risk, the ongoing long-term risk to that child and perhaps to many other children is so great, and the damage is so great, many feel that the seal of confessional should be put aside because that need to cater for that child or the risk is greater than the need for confidentiality. What is your view?
My view is complex. But I'm very much aware that if you don't handle it correctly, you can do more damage. Mm-hmm. So I think what I'd hope from the Commission is an encouragement to the Church to workshop this more carefully with its theology and its pastoral practice, because it's not just about abuse. It's about being attentive to things of hurt and shame that hurt young children and what you do with it. One of the things I learned in Ireland when I was visiting there was people are very clear what to do if they hear something and who they take it to, and not to, because sometimes we feel as pastors that we have to deal with the problem. But in fact, what was clear, I think, in some of the processes, you know who to hand it on to. And it would seem to me in cases where I could protect confidentiality, I might also be able to take it to someone that child trusted and say, I am concerned about this, and not break the seal of confession, because they were not confessing their own sin.
In that review or workshop or examination by the Church that you suggest, would you think a guiding principle should be to view it, that review, in the light of what is in the best interest of the child, which of course may vary according to the circumstance?
I think the best interest of the child and anyone who is vulnerable. I think, you've heard in the Commission that confession practice has changed a lot over the years. We don't hear as much as we used to. Most of us have never had these cases come before us, so there's those issues. But I think it is, and most of us don't watch other priests hear confession. So we don't know what they do. So I think what you've tapped into is an important learning for all of us to do it better.
You see, one witness told this commission in these hearings that even if they knew a child would continue to be abused, they would keep the seal of the confessional. Now that's quite a chilling statement in the raw, but of course, as you've indicated, there are complexities attached to how you deal with such things. And that, of course, is a matter we must consider. Do you think that we have sufficient judgment yet to make the view that if a child were to indicate that it is being abused, in other words, they haven't sinned,
That's right.
it's not a crime that they've committed, that is not covered by the seal of the confessional?
I think one could take that approach. I think if I was hearing that person, I'd be wanting to say to that person, what can I do to help you out of this confession? Can I walk with you? Can I take you? Can I go to someone for you? And I know in some communities, they won't want you to do anything. So I think we have to work through this a lot better.
Mr. Gray?
Yes, I have a few questions, Your Honour. It won't take me very long, and I'm happy to do it now if that's preferable. I might go to the end.
When you say not very long, how long are you saying?
I would be surprised if it went for 15 minutes. Sister Locke, first one question to you. Reference has been made in various ways over the course of the Royal Commission to various aspects of the culture within the Church, or at least parts of it, as being an important factor in exploring why abuse has occurred. Do you have any views on this question of the culture within the Church and what aspects of the culture should change?
Well, yes, I do. We're addressing abuse here at this Royal Commission hearing, and all abuse is, in my view, linked strongly with an attitude of dominance of one person over another for whatever reason. And a dominance is an abuse of power, and I think the Catholic Church has got a problem in that almost all power in the Catholic Church is highly clerical and highly genderised. And I think those two factors need to shift if the culture of the Church is going to shift with regard to the attitude that any person can have dominance over any other person. And I'd say that's all closely related to the model of church, and I would dearly love to see our church go back to Vatican II, pick it up, read it, have a look at the model of church. I know that's been said by other people, but I think it's really quite key. The way we think affects the way we act. And if we are working out of a hierarchical model of church, which is highly genderised, highly clericalised, we will not shift without shifting the model. I'm not sure I can say much more about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, can I ask the other members of the panel generally, I suppose, firstly, whether anyone has a view that's in disagreement with that, and secondly, whether anyone would like to add to that. Maybe, Brother Clinch, if I could ask you first.
Yes, I can follow what was said by Bernice. It just something that we're in a world today where women have a significant role, and the community I know that I'm in, where women would take leadership roles. And so when we look at communities and society around us, the church seems to be out of whack or out of step with that. And the feminine influence that comes, I know from my own life, I've phoned up some religious sisters for advice, because I know they come from a leadership model which is circular and which is more helpful than a hierarchical model for me in my situation. So I'd say one of the gifts of our society has been the greater awareness of the gift of the feminine, and yet I can't see it emerging in our churches strongly. But while I say that, I know that in the Church of Australia and the Church of America, I look to the religious women for leadership. And they were the ones with the writing in spirituality and in theology that I think have a future.
Is there any other member of the panel who would like to add anything to that brief discussion?
I'd only endorse what had been said by Bernice and by Peter there, and I believe we have to bring women much more into the power structures of the church, and it can't just afford to lie at the tokenistic level, which it generally does. It has to be real, and it has to be deep-seated and embedded.
Thank you. Now, Brother Clinch, one brief matter for you particularly. At one stage this morning you were asked about the international protocol which is currently being drafted by the worldwide order, and at that stage this morning at least you were, I think, not sure whether the subject of early reporting to police and other authorities was part of that international protocol. Remember that? Now, in terms of Australia and the province of Oceania, you already have in place the various protocols and procedures that you have listed in your statement. Is that right?
Yes.
And so far as those Australian or Oceania protocols are concerned, do they include requirements as to early reporting to police and civil authorities?
Certainly it does, yes.
Then, Brother Carroll, if I could ask you one question just concerning the topic which a number of you were asked about, namely how to deal with a member of the order who has been convicted for an offence of child sexual abuse, or in relation to whom there's been a substantiated claim in some other way. And you spoke about the situation that can arise where the brother is a restricted brother and he's in that situation living in a community with other brothers. What is the effect, to your observation, on other brothers in that community when that happens?
It's a vexed question amongst us. Some would believe that the brothers should be dismissed. In the communities they're in, I suppose we have had to structure those communities so that there are people who are supportive and who are accepting of having restricted brothers living in their midst. But it is challenging and it is difficult for them because they don't understand why these people have done what they've done, and they actually believe that it's left an indelible mark on them, that is, those people who haven't offended, and done incredible damage to so many people. So I suppose one of the realities is that it has caused us to think a lot about these issues of how we integrate them and support them without ever condoning it. But they remain, I suppose as long as they are in communities, they remain a very obvious reminder to us of what can go wrong and what should never go wrong again. I suppose that is one point about their presence in communities.
Brother Graham, I just had one question for you. One matter that the Commission has heard evidence about in the last few weeks, and indeed over the last few years, has been the question of continuing professional education for priests and religious, and among other things, whether that should be mandatory. Now, I think you are yourself a qualified psychologist.
Correct, yes.
Do you have a view as to whether continuing professional education should be mandatory for priests and religious?
I think that as a priest or a religious, that is an important profession. Best practice in this day and age would suggest that continuing development programs are in place for many, many professions. And I think that would be an important... It needs to be coherent and national, as is the psychology continuing professional development program. So it needs to be a national approach where people to be registered to work their profession need to reach certain standards each year. That just seems to be normal practice in our society these days.
And I think, Father Chambers, I see you nodding as that answer is given. Would that be your
I'd certainly agree with that, yeah.
Yes.
But it has to be a national approach. It can't be a diocesan approach, I believe.
Would anyone else like to comment on that topic? Right. Well, in that case, I have no other questions.
Thank you. Three, nothing. And each of these gentlemen and sister can be excused.
They can, Your Honour.
Thank you all very much for your contributions. We've seen some of you more than once. I'm very grateful for the contributions you've made and for the interesting discussion we've had today. And now each individually excused. Now we'll adjourn until 8 o'clock.
8 a.m. tomorrow.
8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Very well.